Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 45 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to hit a topic that one of the things I've always loved about being a student of psychology is at the same time we get to learn how to help people heal, live better lives. And at least for me, you learn a lot about yourself as well. And this is one of the concepts that we're going to tackle today with trauma and the fixed mindset, where as I read Carol Dweck's research on this, as much as it challenged my clinical work and thinking and has worked into my trainings, I had to confront some things in my own life as well. And so I'm really excited to tackle this topic of both the fixed and the growth mindset as we explore these issues. I'm thinking this will probably be knowing us 2 episodes, but we're going to sort of tackle the fixed mindset and how trauma and just a whole lot of stress and challenges in people's lives can sort of get them in this place where they get stuck in their thinking. And often we see this in self-esteem. We've talked about the impact of shame and the sense of unworthiness. And I really think the fixed mindset gives us a way to look at this and bring in all of Carol's research. So I'm looking forward to this conversation and share some of the insights that it's had in my own thinking as well. As always, we'll start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. I've read some really great books lately, and one of the things I try to do is I always try to have a book that's related to my work and then a book for fun. But if you listen to the podcast or know me, you know my fun books are usually books that people would not consider fun and just too nerdy to be enjoyable. One of the ones I picked up for fun, I was actually in the airport in Boston. I was just looking for a book that, you know, just kind of was going to be enjoyable. And I picked up the book or the audiobook, American Pain, about the opiate epidemic, especially the pill mills in Florida. And this book, I just highly recommend it because it's a great read. It's a tragic read, but it's this story of kind of these crazy criminal thinking guys who created medical facilities and basically flooded the South with opiates. And it just put the epidemic in such a perspective of how unlike a lot of epidemics, I kind of started my career during the crack epidemic in the mid-late 90s, how systematically the medical institutions, big pharma, and state legislation really created the perfect environment for this to take hold. So I've been thinking about this book ever since I finished it a few days ago. And so it's American Pain. It sounds like a depressing read, but it's a real fascinating read. And the story's just incredibly well told as well. So that's been my bright, shiny object of the week. Jerry, I know you've got the British Open on in the background, but anything else you're thinking about this week, my friend?
Not much. But besides that, I want to kind of recognize I got a chance to do the keynote at the Colorado Association of Family and Children Agencies this week, and Dr. Skip Barber is retiring after some 40 more years here in Colorado. He was the chief psychologist down at the state hospital and ran a children's home, and he's been really influential in kind of shaping a lot of the policies here in Colorado around children and families. So, after so long and having people, oftentimes when we're out doing this work, people who are actually writing the policies that are directing some of this don't get a lot of recognition. So I want to kind of recognize him, but also all of those people who work so detail, really kind of looking and organizing the policies that allow us to do the work. Sometimes they get in the way, but sometimes they really kind of create the environment that helps us to kind of be responsive to the people that we most care about. So thanks, Skip, for the years of work and dedication.
Absolutely. And I've gotten to know Skip through you, Jerry, and ended up in a lot of meetings with him. And I'll just echo that as well. I know he's been a huge advocate for mental health and for, I kind of got in where he was really advocating for helping organizations as well. And just a ton of respect for both his brilliance and passion for this work. So great role model out there for a lot of us.
I'm getting back to the British Open now.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll see you later, Jerry.
Curt, what about you? What are you thinking about this week?
Well, it's clearly a very bright, shiny object in Jerry's visual field.
Exactly.
I have two. Actually, one is following on from our conversation last week about trauma and the heart. There's a great book if people want to kind of pick it up as a way to kind of understand polyvagal theory in a nice read. There's one called it's called The Pocket Guide to Polyvagal Theory. It's written by Stephen Porges, and basically it's transcripts of interviews that he has done. It's a nice way to kind of get a good understanding of it without the and he says it in his book as well, that his original book explaining polyvagal theory is what he would call dense.
Yes.
Very dense. There's a lot of detail in there that can be really kind of hard to wade through. So he put together this pocket guide, and it's a great resource.
Oh, good. Excellent. I'll check that out because I've got his book, but I'm having trouble getting through it after a couple of years.
Yeah, it's a great book. And if you do any kind of just a simple Google search for some podcast that Stephen Porges has been on, when you hear him talk about polyvagal theory, it really can help understanding of that approach. So
excellent. We'll put that link on our show notes as well.
Yeah, great stuff. My other one is about being an uncle, which I really enjoy doing. I have great nieces and nephews, and I got a message from one of them. Her name is Aubrey. And she sent me a message a couple of weeks ago that she was listening and watching our podcast. And I always forget ages as an uncle, so sorry that I always forget, but she's about 10. And so I wanted to just kind of give her a little shout out and a hello from listening to us. And she really enjoys both watching and listening to the interaction between the three of us. So it was really fun to get a message from her. I thought, even in thinking about how we were talking about technology, and technology gets a lot, kind of a bad rap sometimes, but it's a great way to stay connected. And it's one of the best ways I get to stay connected to some of my nieces and nephews who live a long way away. So always happy to hear from them. And it was fun to hear from her the other day. So hi, Aubrey.
Awesome. Hi, Audrey. And just for all those big sponsors out there like Spotify or Audible or Blue Apron who sponsor podcasts, we now have the 10-year-old demographic down too. So we can add that to get those big dollars someday, which I'm sure is just right around the corner. So come on, Spotify. So let's dive into this, and I want to introduce a little bit of Carol Dweck's research. But before we get into the fixed mindset, I want to introduce this in the context of what she calls the growth mindset, because that's really, I think, the core of her research. And she defines the growth mindset, and I'll quote her here. It's based on the belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through your efforts. Although people may differ in every which way, they believe that a person's true potential is unknown and unknowable, that it's impossible to foresee what can be accomplished with years of passion, toil, and training. So basically, to kind of sum up what she found with this growth mindset is she found that people that, whether they're professionals, whether it's in your personal life, that see themselves as a accumulation, and their success is an accumulation of the work that they put into something, really thrive. It's the folks, and this kind of brings us into today's topic specifically, that she calls are in this fixed mindset that thinks, hey, I'm either good at something or I'm bad at something, and we're pretty much born that way. And one of as I'm reading her book, and her book's called Mindsets, and we'll put a link to that on the show notes as well. I'm just, as she's describing this fixed mindset, I'm like, holy hell, she's talking about me. And one of the things that I really saw, and I use this example in my trainings, is I always would say the statement is, I have no musical talent. And I use, to justify this, if you ever see me dance, which is outlawed now in most of the Western United States, I'm kind of like that wacky wavy arm thing at the used car dealerships. If you've ever seen that, it's got the fan, and I'm 6'7", if you've never seen me in person, and sort of thin and just kind of big arms. And so my wife took me to the club. There was this really like dive bar club called Crocs. I think it's shut down, probably for health code reasons. But my friends always love to go to this dive bar, and they play like 80s music. And, my wife met me out there when we first started dating, and she made me go up on the dance floor. And it's sort of a public health issue when I'm dancing, because being 6'7", my elbows are like right at everybody's head level. And I have this theory that if you're normal sized and you're a bad dancer, you can kind of blend into the crowd. But when you're 6'7" and you're like a good foot above most everybody else, the DJ's kind of getting nervous. People are kind of moving off the floor because it's sort of a natural disaster happening. So while I'm rhythmically challenged, I tried to pick up a few instruments in my life. At one point, I tried to play saxophone in third grade. And if you've ever gone through the experience of either yourself or somebody else learning a woodwind instrument, you know that there's this high pitch noise that can happen, which basically makes your ears bleed after a while. So I tried that, and then I thought in college that if I could play Journey on the guitar, maybe faithfully at parties, that the ladies would find me just a little bit more attractive. And just, if you don't know my age, I was in undergrad in the mid-90s where there was a lot of good music out, but I thought, some love ballads from the 70s would make me cooler, which is why I wasn't very cool to begin with. And so I thought about her work and the fact that I would say I have no musical talent. And when I started to think about how much effort I put into learning an instrument and becoming musical, it was that 6 months of band in third grade. And then about the 3 months I tried to learn a guitar, bought a Journey songbook, and then sold the guitar at a garage sale because I couldn't get anything out. And so with that and a lot of other pieces of my life, I really realized that things that I said I can't do or I'm not good at was not because I was born either good at it or bad at it. It's because I hadn't put the effort into building that talent. And then, and this brings it to the trauma piece, I was trying to, I had this exercise, and this is where I really like to get your guys' thoughts on this as well, as I would have people in my trainings think about the difference between the victim mindset and the survivor mindset. And we talk a lot about that victim mentality, and it's not a strength-based way to look at it. I always struggle with that word, but I also realize that if you've experienced trauma, you are a victim of something. You're a victim of a natural disaster. You're a victim of somebody else hurting you, abusing you, that sort of thing. So there's sort of this natural reaction. And on this podcast, we've talked about feelings of shame and unworthiness that sort of start to dominate our psychology and our view of ourselves as well. And so I'll just kind of go down the characteristics that she talks about with this fixed mindset, and then kind of throw it to you guys to see kind of how you see this in folks that you've worked with. So here's her list of kind of characteristics of folks, including myself at times, that are in this fixed mindset. One is focused on being judged. And this was one that rang pretty true with me for a lot of the folks I've worked with. Even though if we were all trying to be strength-based and non-judgmental and that unconditional positive regard, a lot of times the folks I've worked with just beat themselves up constantly. And if I'm honest, I did a little bit of this, a lot of this in my life, especially in sports, but also in academics as well. That the situation, I would say the trauma here is bigger than the individual. That life and my challenges are bigger than me. That I don't see that I can overcome these challenges. I think this is one that we've probably all seen, that there's an increase of depression or anxiety in the face of hardship. So if things don't quite go my way, I'm either get very angry or anxious or kind of get withdrawn and depressed. The belief that some people are born superior, but I might be born inferior. It's kind of like I have no musical talent. And other people, and we always I think, as a society, do ourselves an injustice. Jimi Hendrix was the one that always stuck out with me is, oh, Jimmy just picked up a guitar one day and just started to play what he was hearing on the radio. Well, every time we look a little deeper into these stories, Jimi Hendrix probably, I imagine, practiced thousands and thousands of hours to be Jimi Hendrix. Maybe he was born with a little bit more genetic ability, but again, I think when we say, oh, LeBron James was just born to be this incredible athlete, ask LeBron James if you ever see him how many hours he spends practicing working out every day. He puts it all on Instagram, so you can check that out. He documents that pretty well. And the end result of this fixed mindset, which I see in so many people that I've worked with, is we miss opportunities for growth. We start to internalize that I am not a worthy person, that I don't have the ability to change my situation. And so we get sort of stuck in that, and we really miss those opportunities for growth or improving our lives. And so I just kind of like to get your guys' impressions of this work. And I know this isn't the first time you've been introduced to some of these topics, but how do you see if we use the term, and again, with a big asterisk of it's not strength-based, but this sort of fixed or victims mindset? I just kind of wonder, with the folks you've worked with, how you've seen this sort of impact their thinking and ability to kind of change their life situation and kind of find motivation to do some work. So any thoughts on that, or my lack of musical talent and dance ability? Either one of those you can take.
I say, Matt, you have a special ability of asking very big questions.
Thank you.
Very big question. I think as you were talking, I was thinking about one of the kind of dilemmas that human beings are in, and not just human beings, like organisms in general, are in a dilemma of balancing safety and risk all the time. And when somebody has gone through an extremely, we'll say a traumatic experience, something where survival was at stake, it's very, very easy for that, the behavior and the strategies for surviving that event to become habitual. Mm-hmm. And that once they get stuck, right, that's a part of our biology that is designed to help to keep us safe and help us increase our survival, is to create habits. And so they're very useful. They're great shortcuts. If we had to think about everything that we ever did, we'd be paralyzed. We wouldn't be able to do anything. So our body is developed that way, and our brain has developed that way to give us shortcuts and be very efficient in what we do. Like being flexible requires a lot of energy, requires a lot of our brain to really work very, very hard. And also the environment, in the way that behavior and environment interact with one another, is that when we emit some behavior, engage in some behavior, and get feedback from the environment about that behavior, whether it worked or whether it didn't work, that process is what takes kind of a substrate of variability and starts to constrain it. And so that we're not just doing anything all the time, we're doing things that are actually effective. And that kind of starts to hone in our effectiveness in interacting and engaging with our environment. So kind of a parallel to fixed versus growth mindsets, right? As you think about the balance we're always having to strike between what's safe and what has worked in the past, and what are ways that I can explore and actually change things, or get new experiences that I wouldn't have known otherwise. Yeah. So that it maps on very, very well to what we know about how environment behavior relations work, in that it also works in the brain that way. And not a surprise, right? They would be related to one another. Same organism. It's all part of a large system.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I was going about thinking of, and there are ways to talk about attachment with that, right? I was having a great conversation yesterday with a couple of potential providers for a young man who has had quite a challenging past, and has been in a residential treatment center now for a couple of years at least. And he's got an opportunity in front of him to go live in the community with, some people, like kind of in a foster care setting, right? It's a great opportunity for him. And we were talking about how the challenges of having been in such a structured environment, exploration of new environments is likely to be a challenge for this young man. So having a secure base is really important for him. I'm talking to his potential live-in providers, right, about how to kind of manage this.
Yeah.
In that he's not likely to explore very much. And when he does explore, he's likely to become overwhelmed very quickly. And that they've got to be ready to manage that overwhelm, that anxiety that he's likely to feel.
Yeah.
So that's kind of I was thinking that a lot, and that's kind of a jumble of thoughts while you were talking, from multiple different perspectives, I think, where these two ideas of fixed and growth mindset, or secure attachment and exploration, risk versus reward, those kind of things map onto each other in a lot of parallel ways.
Yeah, and it really, your example, really sums up, I think, a real mistake that I made. And it was a mistake made with as I think most of our mistakes probably are, with the best intentions in the world. And I recall one of the clients I was working with, she was in my, what we called the homeless runaway youth program that I was running at the time, the housing program, mostly for kids transitioning out of foster care that had hit that, magic age of 18 where we stopped giving them resources. And we had worked really hard. I think she just dropped the hint that she might be interested in being a massage therapist. And so we immediately jumped into, let's get her in massage therapy school. And we worked really hard to help her get into this program. And when she got there, she just really had no self-confidence to succeed in that environment. And she probably, what I think my mistake was in a lot of ways, is that even though my intentions were really good, I wanted it almost before she was ready for it. And I think, the young individual you're talking about is, boy, can I succeed in this environment? And that sort of lack of inherent self-confidence, I find, is something that gets, no matter what age people are, really stuck in sort of where they are at in life. And Jerry, I want to throw it over to you too, to get your thoughts on how you've sort of seen this play out in your work.
So, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about this concept of being able to see and know, and really be with your clients, right? And what we're talking today is the new lens, right? So we've talked about attachment. We've talked about the window of tolerance. We've talked a lot about trauma and shame and looking at that, right? And so this is a different lens in which you can see and be with your client, right? In terms of their cognitions, about how they organize their experience and what helps them. I tend to have a kind of visceral reaction when I hear the word victim stance. And part of that is it makes me feel like we're blaming them for how they think, as opposed to this is an individual that was hurt. And whenever any of us are hurt, we tend to develop strategies to protect that part of us that's hurt, right? And I think that their way of protecting those cognitions and how they think about it is, you know what? I'm not going to take any risks. I can't do this. It keeps them safe in some ways, but it also keeps them in a way experiencing the world in the same way. So, you know, you did such a nice job talking about a habit, but those habits serve a function, right? And so, you know, I think that in this work, it kind of sets a dichotomy of this is a good way of being in the world and this is a negative way of being in the world. And really, it's more of a continuum that all of us have a little bit of this closed mindset. And all of us have some places we may have even a little crack in the window of mindset. And that our job is to kind of open that window more, to kind of looking at that. And so, you know, I hear Curt talk about, you know, I'm with this child and now I'm looking at him through an attachment lens. I'm looking at him through a behavioral lens. The more lenses we could kind of create, the more we could see pieces of our clients and help them to see themselves. So, you know, when we look at this capacity to see the world as, if I work hard, good things can happen. If I take risks and make mistakes, that's an opportunity for growth, as opposed to that's an indication of I've exposed a bad piece and reinforced, see, I'm a failure. So much of that happens in the context of relationships that we've had, of people can hold all pieces of us, right? And so I think that, you know, as we understand these kind of mindsets, it's really important for us to think as clinicians, how do we come to an open mindset with our clients? How do we stay in a place that every time they do something, we see it as an opportunity for growth instead of that's reinforcing they're regressing or they're doing bad? How do we really hold them? Because it's in that relational context that they'll begin to have a shift in their thinking. So I you know, you're thinking about music, right? You didn't just develop your context. There was probably when you were little, you probably came in singing and doing something and somebody like put their hands over their ears and gave you some feedback, right?
I remember I was singing Let's Get Physical in the car.
Yeah, right.
I remember this moment. I was in Brookville, Indiana, singing Let's Get Physical. And my sister and I were in the backseat singing that song, and we asked our mom if we might be on the radio someday. And my mother's words were, probably not.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go. She didn't say is you're putting in such great effort. It's exciting, man. Right? Whether it's good or not. So,
nope, maybe shut up singing Let's Get Physical. Yes.
Right. So really, in a way, instead of me focusing on it's good or bad, is really tell me a little bit about your experience of singing and I get to know you. So I really like when you help us bring in different lenses and questions, because that's really what good treatment's about. It's good relationships is really, we're all multifaceted, and one piece of us is how we organize our cognitive experience of the world.
Yeah. And Curt, I want to build on this too with you from that behavioral perspective that you bring on this, because And my mom's going to be in town the week this podcast goes live, and she's got a lot of driving to do. So I'm assuming she still can't figure out the app. So I hate to throw her under the bus again, since she's going to be with me next week, and I love her to death. But the other thing, I think sometimes we, through good efforts, reinforce this fixed mindset. I remember, and as you know, our listeners may not know, I was sort of a train wreck of self-esteem growing up. I grew 6 inches between my freshman and sophomore year of high school. So I walked into my sophomore year of high school 6'6" and 130 pounds. And whatever you're imagining that would look like in your head, I can promise you it was a lot worse. And so I wasn't like overwhelmed with self-esteem at any point in my childhood or adolescence. And so my mom would say things, and I caught myself professionally too as being sort of this cheerleader for folks. So she would say things like, hey, you're really good at math, or you're really good at science. And God love her, she was trying to, after she wrecked my self-esteem for singing about the Let's Get Physical version that we were doing the remix in the back seat. You know, but I think, and Carol Dweck does a great job of pointing this out, when I think I'm good at science, for example, and then I take a science test, and let's say I get a D+, all of a sudden something, and again, as parents or as authority figures tell you, hey, you're good at this. That's your, as we've talked about, that's kind of your state, is that you're good at science. And then you get feedback of saying, no, I'm not good at science. And Carol's argument is what my mom should have been saying was, you worked really hard on that science test, studied hard, and got that good grade. So I think a lot of times too, and you know, is that we try to sort of be cheerleaders, but in that cheerleading, we sort of put states or characteristics on people as ingrained things that don't evolve over time. And I just, you know, as a protective characteristic, like Jerry said, and just kind of some of our language, Curt, I wonder from your perspective, kind of, what do you think some of the behavioral aspects of this might be, especially as maybe that protective factor that we grasp onto?
So what you're describing is what Carol Dweck says, reinforce effort.
Yeah.
Praise effort, whether not necessarily accomplishment.
Yeah.
And she's got a great point there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great point. There are, with anything, there are downsides to either one, right? We also, like, accomplishment is accomplishment, and that can function as a reinforcer.
Yeah.
So let's go kind of back a few episodes to where we talked about a diagram of what areas of the brain get activated when the reward circuit is activated, and what types of events can activate the reward circuit. And then there are lots of things that we would think of that are pretty, like, I hate to say no-brainers because we're talking about the brain, but yeah. Things like drugs, alcohol, sex, sugar, you know, think like, obviously, like money, things that get paired with all of those things. So things that meet biological needs then are very powerful motivators of behavior. One of the ones that I think is probably the most interesting on this picture in my head that I'm viewing is behavior that is consistent with a value system. And that is something that at this point is almost uniquely human. At least we don't have the information to find out from another species if they do that or not.
Yeah.
But we can do that. And that's a unique thing about our species. In the behavioral language, we call that rule-governed behavior. And in the behavioral world, we can divide even types of behavior into two major categories. One that is unique, at least to humans, although we're getting some really cool literature about that it might be some other species who do this too, is rule-governed behavior. And that if, say, you tell me, Curt, there's a, you know, if you stick your finger in that light socket over there, it's going to hurt, so don't do it. And I never do it. That's a very different experience than if I walk over and I stick a finger in that light socket and I get shocked and I never do it again. Those are very different experiences of learning. And then so when we think about fixed versus growth mindsets, we're getting into rule-governed behavior. And what we know from the literature is that when there's a discrepancy or really kind of a battle or a dilemma between rule-governed behavior and contingency-shaped behavior, rule-governed behavior can actually win out in the short run. We will follow rules even when it doesn't match a contingency. Right? So eventually the contingency will win. It is ultimately more powerful to have a direct environment behavior interaction that will then change what the rule is, right? So the rules are rooted in some physical experience, but in the short run that can win. And there's great literature on it. It's really, I mean, it's really cool. It was done in the 80s, and if you want to link to it, I'll send it to you. It was really, for me, it was awesome. I loved reading it. I was an undergraduate and read that article and was like, oh, well, that just changed my whole life.
Boy, you sound like Matt.
That was 20 years ago too. And I'm still quoting the same literature and 20 years later.
That says something about the literature.
Yeah, it's really, really good research and not super well known even in my field. So I think of that in my lens of viewing the symptoms and the problems or the issues that people that I'm treating or interacting with, even from a leadership perspective to a treatment perspective. I'm always holding those two things of rule-governed behavior versus contingency-shaped behavior. And as a leader, I'm always trying to arrange the work environment so that the rules match what the contingencies actually are. And if I can change what the contingencies are to match what I want the rule to be, then the match between those two things is going to generate a lot of change. If there's a dilemma and a discrepancy between those two things, then you're going to get, in the cognitive psychology world, what we will call cognitive dissonance. Yeah. And so that's where that struggle lies. So in your example of, say, I thought I was good at science, and then I took a test and I got feedback that I wasn't. You had a rule that you were kind of following, and then you got feedback that rule wasn't quite right. And so you've got to like struggle with that dilemma. And that's the challenge with fixed and growth mindsets, is that we're following some verbal rules, although they are covert sometimes, verbal rules or how we think about the world. When we get feedback that those rules might not be accurate, then that kind of disorganizes us, and we have to reorganize the way we're thinking and changing what those rules are that we're following.
And Jerry, this also, you know, what Curt's saying, and I think also what I've thought about with the fixed mindset as well, is a lot of times it becomes a very rigid, and we've talked about rigidity before as sort of being outside our window of tolerance, or for those that haven't seen that episode, more of our cognitive brain, so to speak, where we're flexible, adaptive, you know, coherent, energized, and stable, creative, all these things. But there's this real rigid reaction where, you know, it's like, I'm not good at this and you can't talk me into questioning that. There's almost a lot of, when I study traditional healing cultures, something about shamanic cultures that I find very informative about the work of trauma is that, you know, historically we talked about trauma and pain sort of attaching to us. And sort of having a trouble giving up negative conceptions of ourself, or our weaknesses, or our pain and suffering. And again, nothing intentional necessarily, but this is maybe how it feels to us when we're sitting across from somebody. And I just see this rigidity, this fixed mindset, keeping so many folks just stuck. And it's, I think sometimes our best efforts where we want them to go to massage therapy school, go to college, get their GED, get into this housing program, a lot of times we'll jump ahead of sort of where their confidence level's at. And I wonder, you know, just any thoughts that you have on how do we help meet people in that sort of mindset, that state of rigidity, that state of low self-esteem, sort of that results a lot of times from trauma, and at least help them to see that they are somebody that can accomplish some greater things than maybe their current struggles.
Another really hard question, right? Very good, Matt. So, I could talk to you from my experience, right? My experience is that when somebody shares their mindset or their perception of themselves in the world, and it goes against using Curt's language, our rules or our beliefs about the world, right? We tend to want to change that person to match our rules. So your mom hears you struggling and she wants to tell you about, well, don't worry about that test. You're still really bright. She didn't really help you deal with what you were feeling and how it managed, right? Mm-hmm. And so in a way, when I've been with my clients and they've told me, I'm really no good, or I'm damaged, or I'm never going to change, or, the world is this really crappy place that only bad things happen. When I get into a spot of trying to tell them that's maybe you ought to relook at that and change it, nothing ever good comes from that, because really that's about me trying to manage my own internal experience of that, really. So when I can say to them, wow, you've done such an incredible job living in the world with that kind of mindset, mm-hmm. I focus on it and I say to them, tell me more about that, right? Because what I'm asking them to do is, in the first time, most people don't want to hear that piece of them. And it's through this kind of interactional process that they can begin to have some incongruency between what they're feeling and what they're experiencing with me. Mm-hmm. And that creates this dilemma for them. So instead of me saying, no, you're not bad, no, you're good, no, no, it wasn't your fault. Whenever I've gotten into that spot, really my clients who've really been really trusting of me have told me, you don't get it, mm-hmm. in one way or another, right? When I've told them, it wasn't your fault or the fact that you engaged in sexual behavior and now you feel like you're a bad person because you did it. And I go, no, that's, you were young and it wasn't your fault. It's like, no, you don't get what I'm feeling. Right. So I think that I have to tolerate that somebody's living in the world under different rules than I am, mm-hmm. first way, and not try to make it congruent with my rules, but really be there to have them explore what that rule has. How has that rule both become a problem for you, but also how it's kept you safe and helped you to kind of manage those kind of things. So I think that understanding just what Curt said, that we develop these rules and there's things that happen that either reinforce that or change it. How do I become a change agent? By being present and being with you with it, as opposed to trying to change you. So
absolutely.
My experience has told me, and that really on good days, I could be with my clients and just ask them that question about, so let's explore where that mindset came from. Mm-hmm. Let's unpack that a little bit. That's a really interesting way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that, right? As opposed to, because really the change is going to happen in the context of an experience. So how can I make this experience different by holding that part of that person? And that's really just a part of that person. So I know the struggle your mom had, right? Because she loves you and cares about you and wants you to feel better. But it's in holding your experience that makes you feel better, not by talking you out of it.
Exactly. And beautiful answer. I hope everybody, if you're kind of spacing out there,
Go back and
rewind
watch
the
that
podcast and listen to that again. That's where I was hoping we would get with this concept, because again, I think it's there's something in us, and again, I do blame my mother for not reapplying sunscreen
What
during.
is therapy? Would you?
Yeah, I've forgiven her for this, but reapplying sunscreen, not quite yet. Reapply sunscreen to your children. But I think that my mom was expressing, I think, something natural in us to say, when I see good in you, and this is tricky because I think there's interesting research, and Curt, I think you mentioned this as well in the leadership context, where recognition rich environments are high performing environments. But there's also, so I think we're drawn to pointing out the good achievements of people. There's something, you're good at science. That makes me feel good to say that to you. I want you to feel good when you hear that. And I think, Jerry, you pointed out really good for somebody who's struggling, and we see good in them that they're not yet able to maybe recognize in themselves. We have to be careful of jumping ahead of where they are at. And helping them. And I think we can really look at that more next week as well, as some strategies to help us do that going forward. The other thing that I kind of want to, as we got a few minutes left of this podcast, because the other thing that I really have focused on, and Curt, you kind of brought this up a little bit, is our growth and fixed mindsets. And one of the things that, besides looking at, again, helping our folks shift from the fixed mindset we talked about today to, we'll get more in depth in the growth mindset next week, is us getting in the state where we're just surviving the work. And I focused a lot on this because what I see a lot of times, and we all, for most of us at least, work in a resource scarce environment. There never seems to be enough resources or time to give a lot of the folks we work with what we want to give them. And a lot of times what I find with individuals who are struggling with burnout or secondary vicarious trauma is we're just trying day in and day out to survive the work. And in some ways that can become our state. And one of the things that I've really seen is that when we get stuck there, there's a lot of negative consequences to that. And one of the big negative consequences is we lose, if you look down this list, we may focus on adopting that victim mindset. I do hear this in professionals as well, as we'll never be able to do this. We can't do this. Our community doesn't support us. The policies are hurting us. There's just like this really, and most of these are really true, but there's a hyper focus on it, that the situation, whether that's homelessness, whether that's poverty, is bigger than our ability to address it. I'm just kind of going down the list here. Depression, anxiety in the face of all these challenges. It's hard to lose kind of the motivation and passion within that. And then again, Carol's final point is then we miss opportunities for growth and development. So I also see this as a key piece of our own self-care, because I think this work and all the stress involved can get us focused specifically on just getting through the day. And when we do that, if you look at Carol's research, it's incredibly detrimental not only to our work output, but also our overall health and well-being as well. And I just kind of want to, again, throwing out big questions here, but any thoughts you guys have about, how we as professionals, under all the stress we under, might be adopting some of this fixed mindset and some of the detrimental consequences that might have?
I'm thinking about teams that I've worked with, and teams as kind of as a collective. They as a group behave in certain ways, and they can change in certain ways. And one of the most common ones that I've seen when groups get under stress as a collective, they can tend to go towards rigidity and want to get really detail focused, or they can avoid getting the details done and want to go really big, and we kind of miss some of the details. So I think the parallel here is, as listening to Jerry, like, so aptly explain what it's kind of like to be really good at going through this process with people and with groups. Is that part of your job as the leader of a group or the therapist in a therapeutic interaction is to maintain your own growth mindset as much as possible. And one of the ways that, in my experience, I can tell whether I'm doing okay or whether or not I'm kind of stressed and not staying in the growth mindset is that I start to ask questions with the answer embedded in the question. That's my first clue that I'm like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
I need to take a minute here because I want to drive the process.
Yeah.
Right? That's kind of like, I got to work. That's one of my things to work on, is that I want to then drive that process.
And just to point out too, how like Jerry said, how we can get there with the folks we're working with
so
as
quickly.
well as we want to tell them what to do now. Yeah.
So I think I don't have really an answer to your question, Matt, other than be aware of your own kind of cues about those things of, what are my cues for when I'm moving from a flexible mindset or a growth mindset to a fixed mindset, and where I might be missing some opportunities where the group, as a leader, they might be telling me stuff that would be really important for me to know. There are a lot of brains in that room that aren't mine. So that's really useful to use all of those brains to get multiple perspectives. So that was kind of my thought as I was thinking through that. And right back to that, this is kind of my lens of viewing this through that rule-governed perspective of, in the non-behavioral therapy world, we call that beliefs. That's a belief system.
Yeah.
That's a value system. And those are things that are really important. They're part of the context of even behavioral intervention. How people are thinking about things is part of the set of variables that we need to know about that can inform our interventions. So they're really important questions to ask to find out how people are viewing what they're going through and what they're experiencing.
Absolutely. The other concept I've been thinking about is even the concept of our practice. And that word, I just throw it out there. I mean, I think it's one, but really when we look at what the definition of a practice, a healing practice, a teaching practice, a therapy practice, a medical practice, it's something we deliberately try to improve over time. And that word has started to really resonate with me, especially again in self-care and leadership, about making sure that we don't get stuck, that we don't think we have all the answers. And I think, again, Jerry, with that rigidity sometimes, we can sort of get very concrete. I know as you and I have looked at different systems throughout the years and said, boy, this needs to change. Sometimes the system will tell us it's not quite ready yet to go through that process. And I just kind of, as we kind of end the episode, just kind of any thoughts you might have on our own fixed mindsets and how that might play into our well-being and self-care as well.
I was associating while everybody's talking that if you look at science, there are times science has taken a fixed mindset, right? Is that this is your genetic endowment that's driving you. This is when you're born with this amount of nerves in your brain, and that's it, right? To do it. Or your IQ is a fixed entity, and that, you just have. So the cultural context in which we are raised as professionals has a big influence on how we understand the problems that we're facing, right? They're kind of looking at that. And so many of the systems get created during times in which the perception of the problem was a particular way. right? And the metaphors that they use, right? Because we really, our understanding of reality is just a metaphor. It's not real. I mean, we create these things, right?
The Matrix.
So the metaphors we choose to use to make sense of and meaning of our experiences are sometimes pretty fixed, right? And so I think that the science we're talking about today allows us to really have the flexibility to say is experience can actually change our physiology. Experience can change who we are and how we're doing it. And so it's raising new types of questions, and why we're hearing that in science, right? And here's a dilemma for our audience to kind of, because it got presented to me. We're also hearing about that these evidence-based treatments. And what is an evidence-based treatment? Really is I take a set of procedures, most of them that are not created new. Most of them have been around, but I put them together in a way, and I deliver them to a very select, really very controlled population of people.
With a high level of fidelity.
Right? And I do it in a way that I can repeat it so that I do the same thing over and over again. And so when it becomes evidence-based, now I have to do the exact same thing over and over again, when really the group of people that it was kind of tested on is very small. And most of the time with random control studies, we haven't looked at long-term what the impacts of these things are, right? So that we have science telling us that we should be open and flexible in providing experiences. And then we have the dilemma of saying we should do the same thing over and over and over and again.
Yeah.
So each of us as clinicians have to kind of manage this dilemma. We have to be able to say is, what is the science telling us that's working? And who's in front of me, and how do I best apply these ideas to the person that's sitting in front of me? And I think how organizations do that is really different than, say, an individual clinician is going to do that, or how society is doing those kinds of things to kind of look at that. So this mindset really is, how do I stay in an open mindset sometimes when everything around me is communicating something very different to me? And I think that's where change happens, right? So as an elder in society, I'm really telling you that, over time, this is the way this world works, right? Teenagers are telling me, hey, no, we could do this different. And there's a tension that goes on there. And really, I have my role. I was a teenager challenging the status quo at one point, and now I'm the elder saying, no, this is the way the world works. So in some ways, there's always this tension between how much to be open and to do it and how much to change. And I think the tension allows us to regulate the pace of change.
Yeah.
That's really what I think. So some people having a closed mindset, some people having open, and being in a team, we're regulating the pace of change that we can kind of look at that. So I think there's a place for all of this stuff in society.
Yeah.
I mean, to pull it back to your dilemma, Jerry, about I have an evidence-based practice, but I have this person in front of me, right? Going like, I have to do this evidence-based practice and I can't do anything else isn't necessarily the right answer. But also going, I'm just going to show up and I'm going to do whatever comes to mind isn't the right answer either.
Right.
It's somewhere in the middle.
Right.
And that you always find out every single time.
Right.
But
But you have people arguing those ends of the polarity
all the time.
Really, most of us dealing have to kind of manage the dilemma.
Sit in the middle.
Yeah, it was the beautiful thing. I think one of the reasons I fell in love with psychology is that mixture of science and art. Like there was this evolving science there that I could really ground myself in. But like you guys mentioned, when I was facing, if I had a caseload of 12 people, I had 12 incredibly unique situations where I had to adopt that science as sort of a one-time thing for that specific situation, for where that person was that day. And to me, while that can be incredibly exhausting and cognitively difficult, it was what I really loved about this work, is that if I lost that level of creativity, I lost my ability to be effective. If I lost basing it in best practices to some extent, my starting point wasn't all that effective as well. And again, I think it speaks to the complexity, whether you're a psychiatrist, whether you're an outreach worker, whether you're an educator, a medical provider, all this is just, an incredibly complex mix of what we're trying to do to get to help people at a very basic level. So
and part of, back in late 80s and 90s, there wasn't a lot of research that was saying yoga and activities and music and art were therapeutic interventions. And yet the children that I was working with, they were all coming in doing artwork and doodling and listening to music and feeling better. Mm-hmm. So I had maybe I should have consulted with Curt about behavioral intervention, but they were getting reinforced by the things. How do I amplify their positive experiences within the context of a relationship with me that eventually science began to catch up and tell me why that's working. Mm-hmm. So my clients were the ones teaching me about really what was important and valued. And then I had to go to the science to kind of figure out why was that working? Yeah. How does that really why is that making you feel better? Really? So we're constantly in this place of really learning about what I think we experientially discover on ourselves in the world. And then science has to kind of help us to make some sense of those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to give our listeners a little bit of a homework assignment this time, because we're going to shift into more growth mindset thinking and explore that next week. But it just I want to read down this list one more time and see, is there anything you can identify, either professionally or personally, where you feel like you judge yourself, you beat yourself up. You may say, I'm not good at music. I have no musical talent. Is there anywhere you can look at that? Can you identify any situations that seem bigger than you are? And there may be some reality to that, but I just kind of want you to explore that, especially professionally. When you run up against any walls, do you react with a high level of anxiety or depression or withdrawal? Do you believe that you're kind of inferior to some people on some things? And this is kind of the meta homework here. Does any of this result in missed opportunities for growth in your own professional or personal development as well? So that's my homework for everybody. If you really want to be our A+ student, pick up Carol Dweck's book. I've had a lot of people I've suggested to have picked it up. Nobody's come back to me and said, boy, that was a waste of my time. So it's a great work. And next week we'll talk about this fixed mindset. I've also become calling it the hero's mindset as well, and how we can continue to help people really get into this mindset that we know has a lot of positive benefits, both for mental, physical, and social health as well. So we'll continue our explorations. As always, you can find show notes, links to the resources we mentioned, discussion questions, at traumainformedlens.org. I also did dance on screen early on in this episode, so if you want to see that in the video, you can check that out on our website as well. So Curt, Jerry, thanks for another great episode. I think we got some of the deeper insights I was hoping we'd get out of this, and we'll flip to this other side and see what Carol's work on growth mindsets can teach us about ourselves and our work as well. So everybody have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much.
Adios. Bye-bye.